On April 6, 1968, Staff Sergeant Clifford Chester Sims of the 101st Airborne Division threw himself on a booby-trap door to save his fellow paratroopers during a sweep of enemy bunkers near Hugh. He absorbed the full blast. He died instantly. His men survived. The Medal of Honor Clifford Sims received was presented to his widow. He was 25 years old. He was black, and his story, remarkable as it is, represents only one corner of a much larger and far darker truth about how black soldiers fought, died, and were systematically denied recognition in the Vietnam War. To understand what happened to black soldiers in Vietnam, you have to understand what America looked like when they were sent there. In 1965, the Civil Rights Act had been law for exactly 1 year. Voting rights legislation was still being fought in the streets of Selma. Martin Luther King Jr. was still alive. The country that drafted these men was simultaneously telling them they were not fully equal citizens. They were being asked to die for a democracy that had not yet extended its full protections to them at home. The numbers tell the first part of the story. In 1965, black Americans represented roughly 11% of the U.S. civilian population, but in the early years of the war, they represented 23.5% of all Army combat deaths. 23.5%. The reason for this disproportion was not accidental, it was structural. The selective service system exempted college students, and college enrollment among black Americans was dramatically lower than among white Americans due to decades of educational inequality. The professional military, which filled the most dangerous combat slots, had aggressively recruited from black communities since the Korean War, offering steady pay, housing, and benefits that civilian life in the Jim Crow South or the urban North frequently could not match. And once inside the military, black soldiers were disproportionately assigned to combat infantry rather than technical or administrative roles. Project 100,000, Robert McNamara's program that swept up cognitively impaired recruits, further concentrated this disproportion. Over 41% of Project 100,000 recruits were black. They were funneled directly into infantry. They walked point. They swept for mines. They were the first ones into the jungle and the last ones considered for promotion. The 1st Cavalry Division, the 101st Airborne, and the 9th Infantry Division all contained units where black soldiers made up a disproportionate share of frontline riflemen. Specialist Lawrence Joel, a medic with the 1st Cavalry, won the Medal of Honor in November 1965 for treating wounded soldiers under fire for 24 consecutive hours, while himself wounded twice. He was the first living black soldier to receive the Medal of Honor since the Spanish-American War. That fact, stated plainly, is staggering. Between 1898 and 1965, across 2 world wars in Korea, not a single black soldier had received the Medal of Honor while still alive. The 173rd Airborne Brigade's Battle of Dak II in November 1967 put the disproportion in direct human terms. Black soldiers constituted a significant portion of frontline rifle companies that bore the brunt of assaulting Hill 875. The battle killed 158 Americans in 4 days. The after-action recognition largely went to white officers. This pattern repeated across the war with enough consistency that it stopped being coincidence and started being policy. Sergeant First Class Webster Anderson of the 101st Airborne earned his Medal of Honor on October 15, 1967, at Tam Kai. Both his legs were blown off by enemy grenades. He continued directing fire and throwing grenades back at the enemy from his position on the ground until he was finally evacuated. Anderson survived. He received his Medal of Honor in 1969, but Webster Anderson was the exception to a rule that operated with quiet brutality throughout the war. The rule was this. The Medal of Honor recommendation process required endorsement up a chain of command, and that chain of command was overwhelmingly white. A recommendation that began with a black soldier's platoon leader could be downgraded, delayed, or simply lost at any of the multiple review levels above it. This was not always deliberate racism in a conscious, documented form. Sometimes it was the simple arithmetic of who knew whom, who advocated for whom, whose valor was described in compelling language by an officer who shared the recipient's background and understood how to navigate the system. The result was the same regardless of the mechanism. In 1993, Shaw University professor John Sibley Butler published analysis of Medal of Honor awards in Vietnam demonstrating that black soldiers were statistically underrepresented in the highest award category relative to their combat exposure and casualty rates. The study provided the academic framework for what veterans had been saying informally for decades. They knew, they had always known. The question was whether anyone in a position of authority would do anything about it. The answer came in 1996, when Congress directed the Army to commission a comprehensive review of Medal of Honor awards from the Vietnam era to determine whether racial bias had affected the process. The study, conducted by researchers at Shaw University under contract with the Army, examined 452 cases where black soldiers had been recommended for the Medal of Honor or had received a lesser decoration under circumstances that might have warranted the higher award. The Shaw University study concluded that racial disparity had indeed affected the award process and identified a specific group of soldiers whose cases merited re-examination. On January 13, 1997, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black soldiers in a White House ceremony. 6 of the 7 were awarded posthumously. The one living recipient was a 77-year-old man named First Lieutenant Vernon Baker. Vernon Baker's story is the kind that rewrites everything you thought you understood about valor and justice. On April 5 and 6, 1945, in the hills north of Viareggio, Italy, Baker single-handedly destroyed 3 machine gun positions, 4 dugouts, 2 observer posts, and an enemy observation post. He killed 26 German soldiers in those 2 days. He then led his company out through enemy lines under fire. He was 25 years old. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor by his commanding officer, Captain John Runyon. The recommendation was processed through the chain of command and downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross. Baker received no explanation. He spent 52 years not knowing why. When President Clinton placed the Medal of Honor around Vernon Baker's neck in 1997, Baker was asked by reporters what he thought about the recognition coming so late. He said he had made his peace with it a long time ago, but his eyes told a different story. He had been waiting for that moment for more than half a century. He died in 2010 at age 90. The medal had been his for 65 years before anyone official acknowledged it. Back in Vietnam, the pattern Baker had experienced in Italy repeated at scale. Specialist 5 Dwight Johnson of the 1st Cavalry Division earned the Medal of Honor at the Battle of Dak To on January 15, 1968. His tank disabled, he fought for 30 minutes with his machine gun, then his pistol as a club when it ran out of ammunition. He killed an estimated 20 enemy soldiers. He was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Nixon in 1969 and returned home to Detroit a hero. What happened next was almost never mentioned in the official accounts. Johnson struggled severely with PTSD. He could not hold employment. He felt that the government that had decorated him had otherwise abandoned him. On April 30, 1971, Dwight Johnson was shot and killed during an attempted robbery of a Detroit grocery store. He was 23 years old. The cashier shot him. Johnson's mother told a reporter afterward that her son had stopped caring whether he lived or died long before that night. The story of black soldiers in Vietnam cannot be separated from the story of what they came home to. Unlike white veterans from middle-class backgrounds who could access the GI Bill's education benefits and enter an economy that, however imperfectly, was beginning to open to them, many black Vietnam veterans returned to communities still scarred by poverty and discrimination. The VA system was geographically concentrated in areas that were difficult for rural southern or inner-city black veterans to access. Benefits that existed on paper were practically inaccessible. The psychological wounds of combat, compounded by the specific trauma of fighting for a country that treated you as a second-class citizen, went largely untreated. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, dedicated in 1982, lists 58,279 names on its black granite panels. Of those, 7,241 are black Americans. That is 12.4% of the total, slightly above their representation in the general population. The wall does not distinguish how those men died or whether their sacrifice was appropriately recognized. It equalizes them in death, in a way the military system frequently refused to equalize them in life. The 1997 ceremony was a reckoning of sorts, but it was an incomplete one. The Shaw University study identified specific cases but could not recover the cases that were never written up at all, the recommendations that were never made because a junior officer didn't believe a black soldier's valor would survive the review process, the acts of heroism that happened with no surviving witnesses because the men who saw them also died. Those stories are gone. They exist only in the silence between the names on the wall. What remains are the men who did receive recognition, eventually, and the weight of what eventually means. Clifford Sims, who died at 25 jumping on a booby trap. Webster Anderson, who kept fighting with both legs gone. Lawrence Joel, who spent 24 hours keeping men alive. Vernon Baker, who waited 52 years. These men did not fight differently because of the color of their skin. They fought the same way every soldier fights, with everything they had, for the man next to them, in the hope that it would mean something. It meant something. It just took America an unconscionably long time to say so out loud. There is a video on screen right now that goes deeper into the hidden costs of the Vietnam War. And if this story made you feel something, subscribe. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered.